Imperial Japan Conquest and Defiance to the League of Nations. During World War I, Japan seized on an opportunity to enter the war in hopes of expanding its sphere of influence. The Treaty of Versailles, formally signed to end World War I, failed to state what Japan had entered the war to receive. Japan was tragically thrown into an economic and political downturn blamed on the West's newfound love of peaceful compromise. Japan grew increasingly anti-Western and nationalistic. The empire's territorial desires resulted in Japan's decision to triumph through invading and conquering a northeastern region of China known as Manchuria. Circumstances of this invasion contradicted with the demands of the League of Nations. In response, an assembly of the League was held in February of 1933 in order to address the situation. Japan was voted the one to blame, and as a result, Japan departed from the League of Nations. With World War I beginning to affect the world, Japan was deciphering whether or not they should become involved. The pro-German side of the Japanese cabinet proposed that the government side with Berlin or remain neutral. However, the Imperial Japanese Navy and many in the Foreign Ministry wanted to honor the 1902 Anglo-Japan alliance renewed in 1911. This alliance stated that Japan and Great Britain shall support each other if one had become engaged in a war with more than one power. And on August 7th of 1914, at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary, Britain requested that Japan abide by the Anglo-Japan alliance. Japanese Foreign Minister Takaki Kato agreed and overcame the pro-German supporters. And on August 15th, a consequential request was sent to Germany ordering to turn over Qingdao, its colony in China, to Japan and to withdraw its warships. The request was ultimately denied, resulting in Japan declaring war on Germany on August 23rd. Japan sought an opportunity to take advantage of Europe's internal conflicts, thus movement into an East Asian power vacuum began and demanded that the Chinese government, weak and decentralized after the collapse of the Qing Empire in 1912, turn over much of its economic and political power to Japan. Yuan Shikai, the military leader of China, had no choice but to give in to Japan's superior strength. At the same time, however, Japan's arrogance and aggression caused many Chinese to join nationalist organizations of their own. Japan also took over and colonized Korea. Resistance to Japanese occupation here took many forms. In response to these uprisings, many were killed or imprisoned. Foreign conflicts gave rise to social movements in Japan itself. Different sectors of society, including workers, farmers, intellectuals, suffragists, and others, disagreed with the government's request for obedience and national unity. Young people in cities rebelled by seeing American movies, wearing the latest fashions, and buying products advertised in fashionable magazines. Inspired by Russian anarchism and socialism, as well as the success of the 1917 revolution in Russia, radical Japanese intellectuals and workers attempted to create unions for factory employees in order to both raise wages and to send a message to the government. With World War I concluding came the Treaty of Versailles. Japan had entered the war hoping for an extensive amount of expansion, yet as a tragedy, Japan only received German concessions in Shandong, China. However, they believed they deserved more. Japan joined the League of Nations in 1920 as a charter member and one of 4 permanent members of the League Council to maintain accommodation with Western powers. By the 1930s, there had been a growing opposition to Western values, as many Japanese military figures began posing the question: what had embracing the West's newfound love of peaceful compromise brought Japan in the 1920s? The only answer seemed to be economic depression, a shortage in living space, and the infection of suffrage and communism. A growing faction within the Imperial Army wanted to disassociate Japan from the non-aggressive values of the treaty policies signed after World War I and instead pursue colonial expansion. Miya HIROHITO, crowned emperor in 1926 following the death of his father, was tasked with withholding nationalistic views for the imperial military. The emperor had a divine power over his country, in which it was believed that the Japanese imperial family was offspring of the sun goddess Amaterasu. With nationalistic doctrine and an obligation to further expand sphere of influence came the conquest of northeastern China known as Manchuria. With unfair conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, Japan saw it fit to triumph through expansion via pure Asian descent uninfluenced by external ideologies. Thus, China was a target. Manchuria was a land rich in everything that Japan was not: living space and resources. General Hiro Minami, Japanese Minister of War, made a speech in August proposing that the Imperial Army shall act upon its will and attack. However, justification was needed, for it would be against recent treaties signed by Japan. An excuse for an invasion of Manchuria was needed. Based on this notion, on September 18th of 1931, Japanese soldiers blew up a section of Japanese-controlled railway in southern Manchuria, obtained in the aftermath of the First Sino-Japanese War. Japan claimed that Chinese bandits were responsible. The civilian government of Japan told it to withdraw and avoid invasion. However, the Japanese military did not agree and decisively invaded anyway. Formal invasion began on September 19th of 1931. Units of the Japanese Kwangtung began moving henceforth to engage Chinese forces. There was little to no resistance by the Chinese because they knew that the Japanese were just wanting an excuse to invade Manchuria. Within only days, the local capital of Corinth was captured, and by February of 1932, the Japanese had conquered Manchuria. This led to the establishment of the Japanese-dominated state of Manchukuo. Thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians had been killed by the ruthless Japanese army. Emperor HIROHITO was at a crossroads. Shall he accept or reject the actions that his army have taken? The Japanese government professed a desire to continue friendly relations with China and denied that it had territorial designs in Manchuria. However, Japanese military operations continued. HIROHITO took no action in order to halt the aggression of his troops. He was commander-in-chief of the Imperial Army, but the main reason he was able to maintain power was because of the support of the armed forces. Effectively, his decisions were at the mercy of the armed forces. Later in 1932, conflict arose within Shanghai due to a boycott on Japanese products. Japanese forces were sent to Shanghai to alleviate the situation. A treaty was signed in May the same year in order to halt conflict. Whilst this was happening, Japanese nationalists within the government and military were determined to retain firm control. As a result, Japanese Prime Minister Inu Kai was murdered in order to rule out Western compromise and polarize external political views. China appealed to the League of Nations. The League sent a delegation to Manchuria to see what was happening. Manchuria reported back in September of 1932, saying the Japanese were completely unjustified. It recommended that Manchuria be returned to China. 17 months after Japanese invasion of Manchuria, an assembly of the League was held in February of 1933 in order to address the situation. 40 nations voted that Japan was at fault for the war, not China, and should withdraw. Only Japan voted against it. Instead of withdrawing from Manchuria, Japan chose to segregate from the League. Japan formally withdrew from the League of Nations on February 4th of 1933. Japan would go on to maintain control of Manchuria, which led to the eventual invasion of other regions in China, as well as Japan becoming an Axis power, drawing the United States into World War II. Japan would remain departed from the League of Nations until the League's expiration in 1946.
China has long been derelict in her international duties as a sovereign state, and Japan, as her nearest neighbor, has been the greatest sufferer on that score. The adoption of this report would give the impression to the Chinese that they had been exonerated from all responsibility, that they could continue to defy Japan with impunity. It would serve further to embitter the feelings of the Japanese and Chinese peoples. I ask you not to adopt this report for the sake of peace in the Far East and for the sake of peace throughout the world.